All right, welcome back to another wonderful math lesson with the party dog background. So, before we begin, we're going to go over lesson 9-2, and I'm going to go over some important notes for you. So again, you can take a screenshot of this, you can take a picture of it with your phone, or you can rewrite it if you want. You can go ahead and take a picture, pause the movie, whatever. So as we go, here we go. Remember, standard form from the last lesson, y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are usually just numbers, okay? And then we need to remember these symbols. So yes, they're sloppy, deal with it. We have less than, which if we were to graph, it's going to be dotted. Greater than, which again, if we graph, is going to be dotted. Then we have less than or equal to, hence the line underneath, which means solid if we graph, and then greater than or equal to, which is also going to be solid when we graph. That's important to note because we are going to be graphing parabolas. So again, don't fret. It's easier than it sounds, okay? You just kind of have to remember back when you learned this. If not, refer back to the note sheet. Not too big of a deal. Okay. You're going to have to find the axis of symmetry and the vertex for these graphs again. Now, while the last lesson finding the vertex was as simple as counting up and over, or over and up depending on your perspective, I guess, we have to find it from problems in the standard form. So we'll get into it, don't stress too much about it, but we are going to be using this formula. So this formula is for the axis of symmetry. X equals negative b over 2a, where this is b and this is a. So if you look up the formula, you see it in your textbook, in the notes, whatever, you're going to see this negative sign out front of this fraction. You can go ahead and always put it to the top. Okay, you can always just apply this negative to the b. So be careful on problems when b is already negative, because what is a negative times a negative? Positive, so you just have to watch for that. But just for all intents and purposes, you can put that up top. Okay, now, you use this formula to find the axis of symmetry, yes, but you also find the x value of your vertex. So when you list your vertex in point form, that is your x form. Yes, I made a mistake. I had a hard time spelling symmetry, and this was a mistake that turned into a perfect thought bubble. So let's get on to the lesson now. So as you look at problem number 1, okay, problem number 1 is more or less designed to give you an understanding of graphing parabolas. So it's not much work involved, more just understanding. So it might be confusing with the boxes, it's okay. So as you look at your canvas, it says graphing quadratic inequalities, graph the quadratic inequality, y is greater than negative x squared plus 6x minus 5. So it says graph the boundary curve y blank negative x squared plus 6x minus 5. Well, you're going to be graphing y equals. Anytime you graph inequalities, you can substitute out the inequality for an equal sign just so you can understand what this is going to look like. So you're going to graph y equals, that's what goes in that box, minus x squared plus 6x minus 5. Okay. Going down, it says use a blank line because the solution of the inequality y is greater than negative x squared plus 6x minus 5 does not include the boundary. Well, we are going to use a dashed line. Why are we going to use a dashed line? Because it's a greater than inequality, not a greater than or equal to inequality. Remember, the line underneath. So since there is no line underneath, we are going to be using a dashed line. That's what goes in your second box. And then finally, it says shade blank the curve. We are going to shade above the curve. Now, if you look at your graph, it should be obvious they shaded above the pink parabola, right? Well, how did they know to shade above rather than below? Well, was y greater than this function, or was y less than? It was greater than, so we shade up or above. So keep that in mind. This is basically a definition problem, but we will be using this fact later on. All right, moving on to number 2. It says, graph this function, find the axis of symmetry and the vertex. Now by now you should be thinking, what is an axis of symmetry? Well, let's go back to the notes. So the axis of symmetry is symmetrical. It's meaning you can cut your graph perfectly in half. So it's the vertical line through your parabolas. In Algebra 2, you will see this go horizontally, but you don't have to worry about this yet. So we are going to worry about the vertical axis of symmetry. So on this axis of symmetry, you find your vertex and you draw a straight line through it. So far, so good. Now, all we have to do to label the axis of symmetry is find the x value of the vertex, and that is our vertical line that cuts it. So, how do we find the x value of our vertex? This formula. Going back to number 2. We have the problem f of x equals x squared minus 6x plus 9. Now, if you've been in my class, you know f of x just means y, right? This just stands for the function of x, which is this. So we can substitute this out for y, which is what I did down here. Okay, so don't stress too much about that. That just, you can substitute that out for y. So what is a, b, and c on this problem? Well, what is in front of x squared? How many x squareds do we got? We have 1. Now, what is b? It's not just 6, it is -6, right? And then finally c all by itself out here, +9, so +9. That is important to fill out just so we understand. Again, this little squiggly right here is just my thought bubble. It's how I think. If you want to draw it off in a straight lined box, if you don't even want to write it out, that's up to you. This is how my brain works. So now we have our function, we have our a, b, and c. Now let's find our axis of symmetry. So I rewrote the formula, x equals -b over 2a. And like I said before, take this and apply it to the top. So what did I do? I took my negative that was out here and I put it up top. I put a parenthesis where b was, and I plugged in what b was. So what was b? -6, plugged it in. What was a? 1, plugged it in for where a was, hence the parentheses. And now I just simplify that. What is a negative times a negative? A positive. So we have +6 on the top. What is 2 times 1? 2. And then simplify the fraction again. 6 over 2, or 6 divided by 2, is 3. So right off the bat, what is our axis of symmetry? Our axis of symmetry is x equals 3. If you were to graph this, I know it sounds like it's just a part of a point, but if you were to graph this, or remember back a few lessons ago, this is actually a vertical line. Don't worry, you don't need to actually think too much about that. This is your answer for this part of the problem. We have x equals 3. Now, again, back to the notes. While this is the axis of symmetry, it is also the x value of your vertex. So when we're trying to find our vertex, we're halfway done. What is the x value? 3. So what is the x value for the vertex? 3. So what all do we need to find? Just the y value, right? So how do we find that y value? Well, we know what x is. So I rewrote my function with y instead of f of x, just so it helps me understand, right? You can continue keeping f of x there, but just because we write our points x comma y, I like to substitute out y. And then we plug it in. So here we go. X equals 3. Here's x squared minus 6x plus 9. Here's an x, there's an x. I'm going to substitute 3 in for x. Substitute 3 in for x. I didn't need to touch the 9 because there's no x behind it. Now, what is 3 squared? 9. What is negative 6 times 3? Negative 18. And then this 9 gets brought down. 9 minus 18 is negative 9. This 9 gets brought down again. Negative 9 plus 9, 0. Now I already drew an arrow because what does y equal? 0. So what is our vertex? 3, 0. So, like I said, once you get familiar with this formula and plugging things in, substitution, this should be fairly straightforward for you. Okay, do a handful of these problems on your practice, and it should get easier and easier. Now, going on to question number 3. Now's where things get a little bit more complicated. Not necessarily harder, just more steps. So just be very careful with your work. It says graph the inequality, and then it gives you multiple choice. So again, with multiple choice, you have to remember that you can't always rely on multiple choice. So luckily you can, use it to your advantage now, but don't always expect to. So as we go into this problem, y is less than or equal to x squared plus 2x minus 5. We got 3 things we got to do. Find the vertex, find the y-intercept, and shade above or below. And again, this is significantly easier than it sounds. I will go over it when we get to it. So, and again, my handwriting is crap. I know, deal with it. So, number 1, finding the vertex. We need x value and we need y value. Well, we know how to find the x value by using the axis of symmetry formula. Now, I have already put the negative that's out front up on top of the fraction. I like to keep it there. This is how I normally write the equation. It just doesn't match what you would see in your textbook. Your negative would be out front or as I wrote it in the notes, but you can always just apply it to the top. All right, so what is b in this problem? 2, positive 2. What is a in this problem? How many x squareds do we have? 1. So b is 2, a is 1. Here is b. What I'm going to do is put parentheses around it and plug in 2. Where did that negative sign come from? The formula. Where did this 2 come from? The formula. Put parentheses around a and plug in 1. That's how I got this. I plugged in 2, b for 2, and 1 for a. Now I need to simplify. What's a negative times a positive? So negative times 2 is negative 2. 2 times 1 is 2. And then negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. I know I had to cram that negative sign in there. I almost messed up. Now we have our x value. It is negative 1. So we're halfway done with the vertex. If it asked for our axis of symmetry, we would have it. X would equal negative 1. All right, so in those other problems, like the previous one, we would have the first half of the problem done, or your homework. So keep that in mind. Now, how do we find the y value? The same thing as like the last problem. We take our x value, we plug it in for our x's, and we simplify and solve. Now notice I'm swapping this out for an equal sign because I'm solving for an exact number for my vertex. I'm only dealing with that when I need to shade. So here we go. I rewrote the function. Y equals x squared plus 2x minus 5. I plugged in negative 1 for my x's. So negative 1 squared plus 2 negative 1 minus 5. Okay, negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2, and this minus 5 gets brought down. 1 minus 2 is negative 1, bring down the minus 5. Minus 1 minus 5 is negative 6. If you're on negative 1 on the number line and you need to go 5 more that way, you're going to land on negative 6. Okay, don't get confused. When the signs are the same, add and keep the sign. Negative 6. What is our vertex? Right there. Now, when we go down to our graph, we can already plot that point and get started. But before we can do that, we need to find where it crosses the y-axis, which is our y-intercept. Think back to y equals mx plus b. Why did we need to find our b? So that we knew where to graph. Okay, so again, this stems from the line graphing lessons a couple months back. All right, so finding our y-intercept. Now remember, when you're finding the y-intercept, when it crosses the y-axis, okay, when it crosses the y-axis, the x value is always going to be 0. I don't care what y is, x is always 0. And it hits this, x will always be 0. So when I want to find the y-intercept, I plug in 0 for x. It should be very familiar from when we graphed y equals mx plus b. Okay, so very simple, plug in 0 for x and solve. So I rewrote my function here. X squared plus 2x plus 5, plugged in zeros for my x's. So I have 0 squared plus 2 times 0 plus 5. Well, 0 times anything is 0, so keep that in mind as we go. 0 squared, 0, plus 2 times 0, which is 0, and bring down the 5. 0 plus 0 is 0, plus 5 is 5. Dot the line right there. Boom. So far, so good. Now, keep in mind right here at this step, don't get too far ahead of yourself. This is the multiplication part. This is the addition part. So you will not end up with a 0 right here unless you have no number right there. So just be careful when you're adding your numbers. All right. Finally, our last part is we need to know whether to shade above or below. So if we take part 1 and part 2, we can graph our parabola, roughly. Mine is pretty ugly, but it gets the job done. So I have my y-axis, I have my x-axis, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot my vertex, so I would go over -1 and down to -6. Okay, I kind of cheated here, but you get the picture. Now, I want to know, it's going to sprout out like this and this, but I want to know where it hits this line. So that's why we did part 2, 0, 5. So if I go to 0, -5, see, I want to outline my mistake really quick. What is that? Negative sign? What is that? Positive sign? Negative. So as you can tell, as I'm telling you to be careful with your positives and negatives, what did I do? I myself messed up on my positives and negatives. So again, just to show you my mistake, the y-intercept, we did everything correctly except I wrote the problem down wrong. So this -5 is what we bring down. 0 minus 5 is -5. Right? And then -5 is brought up there. Again, no one is perfect, and I am far from it. So please be careful when you do your negative signs. As you can tell, it is very easy to mess up. So as we go, it should cross at my intercept of -5 or 0, -5, 0, -5, right there. Now I can just roughly draw my parabola. And the last thing to note is whether I shade above or below. Well, how do I know? Well, what is y? Is y bigger or less? Is it greater than or is it less than? Well, this says it's less than or equal to, right? So less than or equal to, less than or equal to. I'm going to go less than my parabola. So I'm going to shade downward. If it said it was greater than, I would have shaded this portion, right, above the parabola. But this one is going to be below or outside of the parabola on the lower side. Okay, so as you go on to, what was this, number 3? Number 4 is the exact same problem. Okay, and I want you guys to try to do it yourself using my work here. Okay, you should be able to know right off the bat, okay, what do I need to do? I need to find my vertex using this formula. Once you find the x value, you plug it in and solve for your y, and you have your vertex. So you know where the bottom or the top of your parabola is. Okay, from there, you use the what you know of y-intercepts, plugging in 0 for x, being very careful to write your problem the correct way, and solve for your y-intercept. From there, you should know where your parabola is going to start and cross the y-axis. And then finally, shading, right? So whether it's greater than, shade up, less than, shade down. If it's greater than or equal to, or less than or equal to, if there's a line underneath, you're going to use a solid line to graph. If there is no line underneath, so it's just less than or just greater than, you would use a dotted line to graph your parabola. So looking at number 4, it is y is greater than x squared plus x plus 1. So since it says it is strictly greater than, I know I'm going to use a dotted line to solve this problem. Okay, well, if I looked at the answer choices, there are only 2 with dotted lines. So right there, you're at a 50-50 chance. Just knowing that one piece of information, just knowing whether this is dotted or solid, eliminated 50% of your answer choices. Okay, well, what else do we know? We know y is strictly greater than x squared plus x plus 1. So it's greater than. So it's going to shade up. So it's going to shade this portion of your graph. So on number 4, you know it's going to be a dotted line, and you know it's going to shade this portion because it is greater than. So there is only one answer choice on number 4 that meets both of those criteria. So again, review the notes. This formula is really important and will get you through your homework. Again, thank you for watching. I hope you got through it with the best of your abilities. Please message me or comment or whatever you want to do. Let me know if you have any issues. Thanks for watching.